You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyi with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we would like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make our show possible. With your monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN, you can be named here as one of our associate producers. Or with a monthly Patreon subscription of just $5, you can join our meetings of the Hive Mind on the second Saturday of each month. Watch your Patreon messages for details. Today's topic is Pride Begins with Stonewall. The Stonewall Inn opened on Christopher Street in Greenwich in 1966, specifically as an underground gay bar. The welcoming atmosphere for gender non-conforming people made it unusual, but it was the lack of a liquor license that made it underground. It was run by the Genovese mafia family, as were many such bars throughout New York City. Its existence was maintained by payoffs to local police, though it was still raided fairly regularly to maintain appearances. The staff was usually told to expect a raid, which allowed them to hide or remove any alcohol or other problematic materials. The raids were also usually conducted early in the evening, allowing the bar to reopen a few hours later and to recoup lost business. Raids on underground bars usually consisted of any alcohol being seized and some employees arrested on charges of selling alcohol without a license. At Stonewall and other gay bars, it was not unusual for some patrons to be arrested on charges of cross-dressing, based on a law that dated to the mid-19th century. To catch the cross-dressers, the police checked IDs. Anyone, male or female, who did not present in accordance to the sex listed on their ID was arrested. Stonewall became nationally known in June of 1969 after a raid turned into a riot and a cry to end discrimination against the gay community. The traditional, if not entirely true, story of the events at Stonewall is that a group of drag queens mourning the death of Judy Garland were pushed over the edge by a raid on the bar. One of them threw a brick or a shot glass at a cop, thereby starting the riot which began the gay rights movement. The reality is a bit more nuanced. The actions at Stonewall acted as a catalyst because it pushed the issue to national attention. The push for inclusion of LGBTQ+ rights had existed alongside the other civil rights and counterculture movements of the late 1950s and 1960s, but was often not recognized or included in these. The Summer of Love did not necessarily include same-sex couples. It's difficult to know what was different about the night of Friday, 26 June in 1969. Something about the raid, the people, the atmosphere sparked resistance. It was not as if this was a new experience for anyone, nor, according to the first-person accounts, was the mood particularly different than any other night. When the police conducted their raid, the patrons and staff of Stonewall simply refused to go quietly. People refused to show their IDs, and those who did and were found to be cross-dressing did not cooperate with their own arrests. People released by the police didn't leave, but stayed in the street outside the bar, bringing attention to events that would usually be overlooked. What prompted the violence, the riot, has taken on a mythological aspect. Activist Marsha P. Johnson is often identified as the person whose act of throwing a shot glass set everything off, but she says she wasn't there until after it was already on fire. A friend and fellow activist, Sylvia Rivera, is credited with throwing a Molotov cocktail, but she says she was not the first to throw anything. Another woman is also credited in many accounts as the catalyst. As she was being loaded roughly into a police van, she shouted, "Why don't you guys do something?" Her identity is not sure, though Stonewall bouncer Stormy DeLavere is often named. She has both confirmed and denied that she was that person. Whatever the catalyst, people began throwing rocks and bricks, beer cans, glasses, and anything else they could at the raiders. Some of those they'd already arrested were in the bar, waiting, not quietly, to be removed. The police barricaded themselves alongside these people, trying to keep everyone else out. One of the windows was broken and a fire was started. This forced the cops and protesters alike out of the building. Whether it was demonstrators or police who started the fire is not sure, nor do we know if it was done intentionally. By this time, the New York City Tactical Patrol Force had arrived in riot gear. Their shield wall was met by a chorus line of men singing and doing kicks. Participants say this prompted a surge of violence from the police, who began beating the men with their clubs. This functionally ended the riot, and the street quieted by dawn. 13 people were arrested, 4 police officers were injured, and many in the crowd were treated for small injuries at local hospitals. News of the events on Christopher Street spread through the city and were covered by all of the major newspapers, prompting people to hold demonstrations around the bar throughout that day and into the next. They only stopped when a punishing rainstorm forced them indoors. On the first anniversary of these events, what came to be known as Christopher Street Liberation Day was celebrated with the first Pride parades held in New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Within 2 years, the day was commemorated across the U.S. and Western Europe and is now recognized and celebrated the world over. This is the origin of June being commemorated as Pride Month, an annual opportunity for people in the LGBTQ+ community to celebrate their true selves and to make clear that society has pushed bigotry into the past. Thank you for listening. We would also like to thank our History with the Szilagys Patreon patrons, Ed Chinevere, Laura Dull, Kris Hill, and Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription of as little as $3 at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagys. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on Twitter at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?